Now, the first question that should come to mind when you uh, take a class about introduction to literature is, what is literature? How to define it? Now, obviously, you've heard the name Shakespeare. Yes, so Shakespeare is undoubtedly belong to English literature. His works, thea- his scripts, his drama work are phenomenal. Obviously, he belongs to this literature category. But how about, for example, J.K. Rowling with his Harry Potter series? Now, back when it was first published, back in 2004, 2005, J.K. Rowling is not considered. J.K. Rowling's novels were not considered as a work of literature. Why? There are two reasons. First is because it is very popular. By popular here means that it is for the consumption of general people, and also it is more children oriented at the time. So the first book of the novel was written for, I think it was for elementary students, and also the second series, the second part of the series is also for children oriented. It is not for adult or serious consumption. So that is the opinion at the time, that J.K. Rowling belonged to the popular culture and not the literature. And also, how about Twilight? You know, the series Twilight, which has offended so many people because it is we use the term cheesy for it. It feels so cheap and very obvious. Twilight, what you call that, comparison to our day-to-days for perhaps Sinetron. Yeah, you don't consider Sinetron to be very serious. I mean, it's for casual consumption, for popular consumption. Just almost the same when you compare J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter to Shakespeare, Othello, or Romeo and Juliet. There is a difference in there that you can feel, that when you talk about Shakespeare, you talk about serious stuff. When you talk about J.K. Rowling, it's less serious. When you talk about Twilight or Sinetron, it's way less serious. And how about Netflix? The emergence of Netflix versus films that you watch on the theater, on the movie theater, when you pay tickets to watch, or even documentary films. How about that? How about compare that to YouTube? And also, of course, memes on YouTube or memes on the internet. Can you consider them pieces of literature? Now, some people would argue that they grew up on Netflix, YouTube, or even memes. Some people are sad like that. uh, my point is that some people watch these things on YouTube and memes and Netflix and Cinetron, and they have a great impact on their lives. Now, if we consider literature as something important, what is more important than the things that give great impacts to our lives? Uh, Maybe only some of you have read Shakespeare, meaning that only some of you have received the impact of Shakespearean works. Doesn't that make Shakespeare less important than YouTube that you watch every day, the Cinetron that you watch every day? So we will get to the bottom of that basically in this article. How do we define literature? That is to say, the serious works that we need to study in college, the serious work that is most beneficial or more impactful to our lives. Now, the mayor there has introduced two approaches, the criterial and the prototype approach. And in this article, we will focus on the prototype approach. The criterial, for a summary, is based on certain criteria, that there has to be certain criteria to be met for a literary work to be considered a piece of literature. That is to say, a piece of important literature. For example, for uh, for a serious drama piece, it has to have a very complex plot. That's one requirement. Also, round characters that are just not one-sided. There has to be a great setting, for example. So these are a set of criteria that have to be fulfilled by all of them. That all of these criteria have to be fulfilled for a literary work to be considered a piece of literature. Now Mayer proposes another approach that is more useful, according to him, which is the prototype approach. How close it is to an ideal prototype of the term literature. Now there is a difference here that in the criterial approach, when a piece of literature, let's say J.K. Rowling, for example, does not meet a certain criteria, a certain criteria, uh, then that piece of work cannot be said to be literature. Example, J.K. Rowling Harry Potter is meant for children, while Shakespeare is meant for adults and it requires a lot of learning to understand literature, a lot of knowledge. So the criteria here is set, for example, that it has to be complex, that it has to be for adult, that it has to require a lot of knowledge to understand. Therefore, Shakespeare's work can be put into literature, while J.K. Rowling's work cannot be understood as a piece of literature. So there is a very black and white approach, I would say, when you use the criterial approach, and this is not very helpful uh, because J.K. Rowling, probably sold more books than Shakespeare ever had in his lifetime. That is to say, the impact of J.K. Rowling is real. There are multi-billion-dollar business following the Harry Potter franchise, and it is, if we consider money to be one factor to define reality, then the multi-million business is very real. Hollywood stuff, that costs a lot of money and it brings job to many people and impacts so many lives, other than just the person J.K. Rowling. So you cannot say J.K. Rowling does not deserve uh, to be in English literature. And of course, as we know now, after at least 2 decades, was it 2 decades after for her first Harry Potter publication, we can safely say that J.K. Rowling's work is to be taken seriously. Now, a good definition can detect this. That's why we want to use the prototype approach here. That is, define how close it is to an ideal prototype of the term literature. If we use this term, we can feel that if we take the Shakespeare as the ideal standard of literature, then J.K. Rowling, with its a lot of the complex plot and complex character, is nearer to the is nearer to the definition of literature than non-literature. So that way, people can still say J.K. Rowling has literature qualities. This is like the gray areas. How gray can you get? You know, being that black is Shakespeare and white is non-literature. Like something you scribble on the wall that that may not be a literature, you see, but some writings on the wall is probably the whitest, and Shakespeare, a complete work of Shakespeare would be something that in the black. So prototype seeks to understand the degrees of this grayness, with the black being the more gray being more literature. Now let's go first to the criterial definition so that we can understand what is meant by the prototype approach. Several definitions are being given in the article. First by Welleck, I think it was Rene Welleck. Literature or letters, were understood to include all writing of quality. This is the first criteria, quality, with any pretense to permanence. Immortality is permanence, eternal quality. So Shakespeare has this permanence, and Jerry and Harry Potter may not. So it has to be a work of quality, yes, and it aims to be something eternal. Shakespeare works, although it is set in the historical settings that is the past for us, it has eternal values, morality, for example, or love in Romeo and Juliet, or betrayal in Othello, in that it can connect to even us hundreds of years after Shakespeare. Hirsch proposes another one. Literature includes any text worthy to be taught by students in teacher of literature. Yeah, the kind of stuff that you want to be taught in college, like what you do now. When these texts are not being taught to students in other departments of a school or university. So when I talk about Shakespeare, you will not find it outside the literature department, outside the language department. It will not be taught, for example, in MIPA or in science departments. It will not be taught in engineering department. It is specific only to the language and literature studies. McFadden gave us another definition. Literature is a canon. Now, canon here, I need to stop for a bit. Canon does not mean that brand of camera. It does not mean that a device to shoot things with. Canon here are the classics, means the classics. You know, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, uh, Shakespeare is those are and then Emily Dickinson for poetry. These are very important figures, very important authors and writers in literature. Those are the canon, the classics of literature. That is the meaning of the word classics. Canon is classics. The canon, which consists of those work in language by which a community defines itself. A community, in this case, the English community, the Americans, and the British, and the Commonwealth, defines itself. For the Americans, it could be Mark Twain, or Ernest Hemingway, or Herman Melville, the one who writes Moby Dick. For the British, it can be Shakespeare. So these are very important figures in literature that a community defines itself with. British nationalists will be proudly holding the flag of the Shakespeare, and the American will be proud of Ernest Hemingway or Mark Twain, something like that. These are the criteria that have to be met for a work to be considered a piece of literature. Now, as I said before, this can be very limiting, very narrow, in that it cannot, what you call that, recognize new new works. Obviously, if you consider literature is only the canon, J.K. Rowling will not be there. Your favorite Sinetron will not be there. Your favorite Korean drama series will not be there because they are not Shakespeare. And of course, I don't think we will teach what you call that Gangnam Style anytime soon in our poetry classes, or we will not be talking about anime in the discussion of tragedy and comedy. We will not be discussing K-pop, J-pop, Koreans drama, yet they are important. So how do we figure this out? How do we solve this? Is that we will try the prototype approach. Which I must define this to be an approach, yes. So we consider whether one thing is a literature based on established prototype, which means prototype here means a particularly good example of the word to which other examples of the word bear some resemblance to. almost like a family resemblance. Now, if you consider your parents to be the particularly good example of your family member, yeah, you would consider, sorry, you'd consider your brother or your sister to at least have semblance to your father and mother, and therefore you consider the family resemblance there. That is to say, you can safely say that if a person looks like your father or your mother, it may be that they are your relatives. Your brother looks just like your father, for example, or your uncle looks like your mother, the uncle from the mother sides, of course. So you can say that they are still related. In this point of view, you can say that the Shakespeare terms for betrayal, how Shakespeare, for example, show betrayal in Othello, it is somewhat similar to how, for example, J.K. Rowling shows the betrayal of one of its characters uh, to Harry, for example, how they how they are in the circle of betrayals. One thing that I know from my master's study is that the Bollywood, Bollywood, those Indian movies, they take a lot of themes from Shakespeare because Shakespeare, what you call that, Shakespeare topics, Shakespeare story elements are very powerful. That if they translate those, if those Indian movie makers translate them to Bollywood, they can safely assure their Bollywood movies to have a great impact because they uh, take something from Shakespeare and then they made it themselves. A lot of these are, for example, the Romeo and Juliet kind of romance is very much everywhere, yes, in the Sinetron or anything. So Sinetron is important because it takes something from Shakespeare. Bollywood is important because it takes something from Shakespeare. Therefore, it gives you that impact, that very great impact. Therefore, it has a resemblance. Therefore, this approach can still recognize, even in a very popular works such as Bollywood or Sinetron or Twilight or J.K. Rowling, that they take something from the Shakespeare. And therefore, they can be, uh, in regard to that perspective, they can be considered as having qualities of literary works. Of course, the degrees must be considered, yeah. So a prototype is an ideal standard to which everything else is compared to. You have the prototype, which is Shakespeare works, and you compare the Bollywood films, for example, or the Sinetron to Shakespeare stories. So you know that the Sinetron and the Bollywood learn something from Shakespeare, and everyone agrees that it is to it as the prototype. Everyone agrees. Now this is similar to the definition, the previous definition by McFadden, by which a community defines itself. The community must agree to it as the prototype. That is, everyone agrees that it is a canon or a classic. Obviously, everyone agrees. Everyone that is English speaking, that is, they agree that Shakespeare is a very important work. It is an ideal standard. So yeah, Shakespeare can be a prototype. But before we move on further, sorry, before we move on further, we need to know what kind of definition is the prototype we're talking about here. Now I look at this one from the definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So it is very important in our class that if you find terms that you do not understand, that you will look to the dictionary for the definition of that. And it is also a good start for any research to, if you want to research the word prototype of literary prototypes, for example, that is, you want to do a research on that, you will want to start with a dictionary. Now, this is not a stupid way to start. You don't know the word, you look at the dictionary. No, this is actually a very acceptable and a very good place to start when you are confused with a word, because this is a content class, and we want to be very careful in that. So always consult the dictionary. Now, in this case, the prototype means an original model on which something is patterned, an archetype. Shakespeare is the original model by which other drama works will try to model themselves after. So the newer works after Shakespeare will do themselves a world of favor, will do themselves a great favor if they learn from Shakespeare and take something from it, which really makes sense, right? If you want to write a very good poetry, read other poetries first, especially those that are very famous, and then you can do something with it. Either you try to learn their style, or that you go against their style and create something new. So the first uh, definition here is then the one that works. This is different from the mechanical prototype, like the machine prototype or a plane prototype, the prototype that we used to hear. It is very different from that. So we will use the first definition, an original model on which something is patterned, not a very early version, yeah, which is full of faults usually. When you think of mechanical prototypes, it is something to be repaired. It is different from what we are talking right now, in that a prototype is the standard, an archetype. You can also find the meaning of archetype in dictionaries, see what you come up with. But it is actually the original model which something is patterned, something that a standard, an ideal standard, like I said here, ideal standard to which everything else is compared to. That is my own words. Now let us continue. I already talked about this. We consider the prototype approach, focus on how close is the similarity to the prototype, the degrees of similarity to the prototypical qualities. How much Shakespeare does the Bollywood tries to emulate? How much Shakespeare does for example, the Cinetrons with their Romeo and Juliet are doing with it? If it can capture those very nicely, then we will think that it has more literary qualities that we can work on, that we can research about, that we can discuss about in literary classes. If it does not have a lot of those, then it is most likely have uh, less qualities that we can talk about in literary classes. We can try to, for example, a very famous poem by Elizabeth I, the Queen of England. She wrote poetry on a window, yeah, and then she of course put that poetry uh, in written form, and it became famous. First, because the one who wrote it is the Queen of England. Second, because uh, the content is deep. How do we know that this is deep? We try to relate this poem by Elizabeth I to other poems written by literary authors before that. When we see a lot of similarities, it is complex, it is deep, it talks about a lot of things, then you can make a legitimate study of literature for it. A friend of mine actually did her undergraduate thesis on this particular poem. You can try to Google this poem. It is written by Elizabeth I of England, and it's very meaningful. It is very historical. That's what she was talking about in her undergraduate thesis, and she got an A for that. And she's now very successful. Yeah. Now, unlike Criterial approach, they do not tend to eliminate from a category of literature works which meet only some of the characteristic. I already told you about J.K. Rowling. If you use the criterial approach and uh, you find that Harry Potter does not really intend to be read by adults, one, and the second is that it is meant for easy writing, not very deep or very philosophical writing like Shakespeare, then you would just disregard, you would just stop studying Harry Potter, which is wrong because you can find literature qualities in Harry Potter. Now, if there are some disagreement, some hesitation, some lack of confidence of a work, then they are not the prototype or ideal examples of literature. Let's say, for example, let's take the same case. Let's say someone wants to make Sinetron as the prototype of films. And then there would be people who disagree. No, no, no. The great films in our history is very complex and very deep, while Sinetron is very plain. You have to explain anything to the audience in Sinetron, therefore it cannot be a prototype. Now, if there are some disagreement among the experts, among the people who study literature about a prototype that is being put forward, that being a candidate for a prototype, if there is some hesitation, some lack of confidence, then they cannot be an ideal example. They cannot be a prototype. The prototype is what those literary works that speakers of English will show the strongest agreement and will express the strongest confidence in their judgment on works which have all of these characteristics. Now let's go to the characteristics of the prototypes. Yes.